All right, welcome everyone to the November IGRI Research Seminar. My name is Devor Mondam. I'm the coordinator for the IGRI, and our presenter this month is Kaninik Baradi. He is a data scientist at SBM Offshore, where he's part of a team that supports the oil industry sustainability initiatives. He received his master's in complex systems engineering and management from Delft University of Technology, where he worked with Kaninik Baradi. And his presentation today is titled Ex-Ante Assessment of Procedural Justice in Climate Adaptation, Insights from AI-Supported Institutional Network Analysis. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dava. Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. It's a bit of a mouthful of a title, but I'm very excited to be talking to you about this work today. It's from my master's thesis, which I just concluded about 2 or 3 months ago. But yeah, Amina and I are working still on getting this publication together. So I'm really excited to hear feedback and questions, things like that. So yeah, I'm going to go through a quick overview of the work that we have done, but there is a lot of obviously deep dive technical stuff that we can discuss during questions. So please feel free to drop anything in the chat, and yeah, we can get into the details later on. But yeah, the objective behind this work very broadly came out of some of the work I was already doing related to climate adaptation and climate justice. My background is actually very much in urban planning and urban infrastructure. And one of the projects I was involved in was looking at climate adaptation and vulnerability, especially for vulnerable or informal groups, informal settlements. And one of the biggest issues being discussed right now is climate justice and the fact that most individuals and families that are vulnerable to climate change are actually not the ones that are most responsible for it. And this has become an emerging theme in a lot of research, especially in the most recent annual report of the IPCC. And when these issues of justice are being discussed, normally the view that is taken is a tripartite view of justice. So justice is decomposed. We talk about it in terms of distributional justice, which is access to resources and impacts, but also representational justice, which is who do we consider when we're talking about justice and who do we consider to be a part of the community. But most importantly, an area that needs further research is procedural justice. And what that actually deals with is decision making processes, and it deals with how decisions are being made. And this is an area which I personally found very interesting, especially because to me, procedural justice underpins even questions of distribution or representation, because how you make a decision cannot be separated from what decision is made. And so even when we talk about things like equity, or when we talk about justice in terms of say GHG emissions and allocation of GHG emissions, what we're also in necessarily talking about is how those decisions are made, how the negotiations happen, things like that. And because of my background, the gap I really felt is very much at the local level, especially in climate adaptation, where we're talking about building infrastructure, or we're talking about allocating costs to individuals, to communities, to households. The processes by which those decisions are made are as important as the decisions themselves. And so what we really set out to do with this master's thesis is to attempt to come up with a method that allows us to assess whether procedural justice is present in a policy environment, and to try to do it from just the policy documents themselves. And this is really a key gap that we found in the literature, which is that when we're talking about procedural justice or assessing procedural justice, it is generally done after the fact. After a project has been implemented, a researcher or a aid agency will go in and consult stakeholders and ask them, did you feel like the process was just? But that kind of an analysis doesn't really enable us to fix things before they happen. And so the idea is, as researchers, how do we create knowledge about what was the institutional environment correct? Was the institutional environment well suited for the outcomes that we wanted? And how do we make recommendations about what improvements are necessary before any actions are taken or before anything is implemented. And so to kind of do this, we decided to deep dive on a case study. Chennai is a city in which I had worked previously, and they are the subject of massive climate adaptation investment funded by the World Bank. This Chennai City Partnership, as it's called, involves significant investment into physical, social, and governance infrastructure for the city. And it comes with the World Bank having conducted its own assessment of the institutional environment, obviously not using the methods that we discuss in terms of institutional grammar. It is a much more ad hoc, it's a much more purposeful assessment in that way. But it formed an interesting case study for me because there is an opportunity to compare and contrast with the assessments of the World Bank and to see if we can reproduce or build upon or contest some of their conclusions through the analysis that we do. And particularly because this is again a very broad project, decided to drill down deeper into the water supply and sanitation component, where there is a physical sewer network that has been committed, that is going to be constructed, and where the social risk of the project was assessed as moderate due to issues of worker safety, issues of occupational health and safety, and also a fairly complex decision-making process that goes into these kinds of investments. Then we set out this methodology of how do we want to do this assessment. And obviously, it started by defining what do we even mean by procedural justice, what it is that we are trying to detect the presence or absence of. Intuitively, my feeling was that it would be possible to use the institutional analysis framework, but also the institutional grammar and institutional networks, which are Amine's specialty. And how could those be used to kind of find evidence of this? But this required us to also figure out a way of transposing from the language of procedural justice to the language of institutional analysis, which really hasn't been done previously. And then very quickly, obviously, running into this pragmatic issue that policy documents are really extensive. They're very, very large. And so it wouldn't be possible for me as an individual researcher on a master's thesis timeline to do all of the physical coding necessary to apply the institutional grammar. And hence, we decided it might be a good opportunity to explore and demonstrate large language models as a means of automating certain parts of that process. And then finally, that this work would synthesize into an analysis and into policy recommendations that would hopefully build on what the World Bank's analysis was. And so we'll go through this step by step. Again, as I said, not deep diving into many of these things, but I'd much prefer that we have that as a conversation with questions depending on what everyone is interested in. So first step is looking at procedural justice and looking at what is the evidence of procedural justice that we want to collect. The previous literature looks at procedural justice in the abstract, in contexts such as environmental conservation, and this is the broad framework of what are the elements of procedural justice that we expect to see in a policy environment. As you can see, they're divided into three basic categories of process, agency, and treatment. And each of these is defined quite rigorously. But even at the outset, if we look at the problem statement, it's not really possible for us to assess something like respect in the context of a policy document, because I mean, no policy document is explicitly going to state how individual decision makers are going to interact with the subjects of their policy or with their stakeholders. So we really needed a framework to look at which of these do we expect to see, which of these do we not expect to see inside of the data that we have. And so what I did was transpose these values that you see in the ovals here onto the IID framework, which I'm assuming everyone here is already quite familiar with. And the idea was to look at, okay, within the IID framework, we're talking about interactions, which are here also looked at as behaviors, and there are values that are inherently associated with behavior, like politeness or neutrality. There are also things that are associated with the internal states of the actors, such as respect and trustworthiness, which are either perceived by participants, or are trying to comment on the internal state of decision makers. So after we kind of do this transposition, we're left with four: accountability, transparency, voice, and correctability, as these values that can be said to be properties of the rules themselves. And the idea there being that these are the four things that maybe we would be able to see inside of a policy document, inside of the institutional environment, and not have to rely on external evidence to at least indicate their presence or their absence. We further operationalize this by taking the broad definitions of these values and turning them into the language, sort of the language of institutional analysis, the language of rules. And so, for example, if you look at accountability, we are defining accountability in this context as when a decision maker's action can be communicated to another decision maker, and then that decision maker is able to take another action, or where the rule itself has an explicit sanction. And so the idea is to kind of take one step from this kind of very abstract language of things like, when a stakeholder is able to communicate with decision makers, and trying to move a little bit more towards using the syntax of institutional grammar, or using the syntax of institutional networks to understand these rules, or to create basically a testable hypothesis. If a statement like this is present, then I am, as a researcher, able to conclude that there is some accountability built into the rules in this environment. And then to sort of start looking at this graphically, taking institutional networks as a clue, which is, again, just a graphical representation of institutional grammar syntax. We're looking here at IG 2.0 as theorized by Franz and Saba. And the idea here is to look at connections between statements at the component level. And what this really does is allows us to take that idea of accountability, code that as this kind of prototype IG syntax statement, and then graphically represent that as this kind of structure. So if we again drill down on this here, what we're essentially hypothesizing here is that for accountability to be present in a policy environment, there must be at least one rule that follows this kind of a structure. And what that structure will consist of will be that there is a stakeholder. That stakeholder is able to appeal a decision. The decision is appealed to a different decision maker than the one that they're aggrieved by. And the second decision maker is required to respond or to sanction the original decision maker in some way. And so what we're essentially doing is going from a more ad hoc way of assessing whether or not rules are accountable to these testable hypotheses, where if in the policy documents we can find IGs coded, if by coding the policy documents we can find sentences that match the requirements of this IG syntax, we are maybe able to say that there are at least rules that encourage accountability. Even if we cannot confidently state whether that will turn into just behavior, we can at least comment that the enabling rules are in place in the policy environment. So moving back into the case study, moving back into the case study, what does this mean in practice? What are the actual documents that we're responsible for? So starting from the shortlist that the World Bank itself used for their analysis, we drilled down to 5 documents that were considered to be extremely important to the wastewater projects being considered and being planned. The Water and Supply Sewage Act and basically the local city planning regulation being the most important ones. But alongside that, the internal citizens charter of the wastewater authority itself is extremely relevant, and the Prohibition of Manual Scavengers Act, which is essentially an occupational safety act which stems from long-standing discrimination that is embedded within the kind of communities that do sanitation work in Indian cities. And the documents that we need to look at sum up to around a word count of around 83,000. Not impossible, but definitely not something that we could have done inside of 4 months. And so the requirement was then, how do we maybe use automation or use some kind of a tool to do some of this work and kind of be able to expand the scope of the analysis sufficiently to talk a little bit completely about this policy environment and not really miss out on key information just because it's not located in the documents that we are analyzing. And so the idea to do this was to use large language models, which again pose two challenges. First is obviously to have a tool that can actually do this. There isn't anything really available off the shelf or in the public domain already. And also having benchmarks and methods that allow me to demonstrate that, yes, this tool is at least as accurate as an individual researcher, me as an individual researcher, doing this work and annotating these policy documents manually for the analysis. The overall architecture was to kind of use this very modular interface rather than training an entirely custom model. The idea was to use and compare a number of different pre-trained generative models, the likes of which we have all been using for the last 2 years quite extensively. And so building a tool that can turn abstract policy documents into these structured, broken down structured sentences, then using a large language model to simplify the sentences in the same way that we're suggested to do in the code book and form what are called what we refer to as atomic institutional statements, and then again using a generative language model to go from these atomic institutional statement to these tagged institutional statements, where so essentially in these 2 steps, or rather 3 steps, I would say, of decomposition, we go from a natural language document to basically collections of dictionaries that contain institutional grammar components. And so then to compare and to make sure that this method is working, we took a data set used by, sorry, my slide's not moving. Yeah, sorry, yes. User data set previously used by Bartosz and Stanislaw Grinsky and published in another conference paper, and comparing different large language models on that data set and against kind of the benchmark. And here we're presenting the results of a Rouge metric, which is essentially a sentence summarization metric to look at how similar are the results of the coding done by the LLM to the results of a coding done by a human. And what we find is that the overall accuracy of the best performing language models is in the upper 70s, 80% range, which is quite high, at least comparable to intercoder reliability that we would use when data sets are being split by multiple researchers. And so for the purposes of the research, we took this as evidence that the language models are well suited for the analysis that we want to conduct. And then moving on from here, what is the analysis that we actually want to do on these policy documents? So we settled on both a qualitative and a quantitative component. In the quantitative component, we're using only the institutional grammar. And what we're really trying to identify is what are the components that are a part of the study, which actors are represented, which actors and how are basically actors oriented towards each other in the statements in general. And then in the qualitative analysis, we picked out a few action situations that we thought were interesting, and kind of try to drill down into what are the institutional structures that are really forming, and using network analysis to look at relationships between different statements and what they imply in terms of decision making, or what they imply in terms of their influence on decision making for different actors, for different decision makers. So what we find is that across these 5 documents, there are 5,500 different institutional statements with a total of almost 25,000 different components that are identified. Most commonly, the statements in the data orient towards the board, here referring to the Water Supply and Sewerage Board, or to the government, literally referred to in this context as just the government, and not disaggregated in any other way. There is one document that refers to the regulation of town vending committees, which are quite important to public street use in the city of Chennai. And so we find a lot of statements oriented towards these, but which were ultimately found that they didn't intersect with water sanitation decision making. And then you also find a lot of statements which refer to the local authority or the authorized authority or a person or any person in the abstract. Again, without drilling down at the statement level itself into being more specific about who that authorized authority is, or explicitly referencing where that authorized authority stems from. Um, and then the next step was to go through the rules and to try and find rules that inherently, because of their aim or because of the nature of the action being taken, or the nature of the object being implied in it, are related to procedural values. And out of the 5,500 rules that were analyzed, I was able to find about 30 where the aim or the direct object has an implication for procedural justice. And this search was done essentially by doing a dictionary search over the aims and objects, and to try and find statements that use language that we would expect um, when looking at in the context of accountability. For example, words like sanction, which in this context is used to mean allow and not disallow, but also things like adopt, execute, be sued, disallow, um, deemed to be validly done, deemed to be validly taken. Similarly, for transparency, we see a few statements related to being notified, to furnishing information, to giving written notice. But what we immediately see from these kinds of rules is that most of the rules are oriented from the government to the government, in a sense, because the Water Supply Board is also a government owned, government operated entity, with a bureaucrat as its head. And so essentially, while there are these 30 rules which are related to values of procedural justice, they're not actually oriented in a way that creates power for decision makers, or that creates power for citizens or for vulnerable groups. They're only oriented in a way that creates power for existing decision makers. We are able to drill down more into this also by looking at the qualitative analysis. So a big part so this graph over here essentially is a institutional network. It is representing grievance redressal processes, and the intention here is to look at how our sanitation workers, which who are a vulnerable group in this context, impacted by the institutions that control grievance redressal. And so what we actually look at when we start building out this network, starting from down here, actually, that it starts from a rule that is implied, which is that employees may raise grievances, and it is connected to the existence of this employment committee, which has to be formed by the Water Supply Board under its act. And so, what the board actually creates is this entity, which is the employment committee, and the employment committee is the entity that is responsible for notifying regulations, and the entity that notifies regulations is actually in control of how grievance redressal processes are applied. But what we see is that inside of this regulatory authority, there is one rule that simply excludes laborers and casual workers from being able to access the committee and being able to access grievance redressal. which in and of itself seems like a very reasonable requirement. That obviously the employment committee must only deal with legitimate employees. It cannot be expected to cater to any and every subcontractor that could be implied as being as part of the supply chain. However, when we then compare this to the rules as laid out inside of the Citizens Charter and inside of the Workers' Occupational Safety Regulation, what we see is that the occupational safety regulation disallows the water supply board from employing workers to perform hazardous cleaning, which is the most hazardous work that sanitation workers are generally responsible for conducting. And what we also see is that within the Citizens Charter, what the rules essentially are constructed is that if the owner of a home or the owner of an establishment requests the cleaning of a septic tank, then the water supply and sanitation board will only provide a vehicle for hire to provide the septic tank cleaning service, and it will only provide a vehicle for hire to sanitation workers. But what we see by looking at this institutional environment is that the net result of this is that you're creating a gap, and we're creating this gap where sanitation workers are not employees of the water supply board because it is explicitly only providing vehicles for hire, and it is not employing them as workers. And because they're not employed as workers, they're not entitled to grievance redressal services of the board that is ostensibly responsible for employment and safety related issues, and which results in kind of this institutional environment where these vulnerable workers fall through the cracks. And this is something that in practice we see it playing out in practice, and it is also something that was highlighted within the World Bank's assessment that these risks of unsafe cleaning are likely to happen for sanitation workers. However, what the World Bank analysis was not able to triangulate was these specific rules which lead to these decisions, essentially, and these incentives for these institutions, and which is, from our perspective, one of the big contributions that we were able to do with this research. There are similar but simpler institutional networks that form around issues like project development, where we see that while there are requirements to consult institutions when projects are being planned, we see that requirements to obtain permission from government entities are very explicit, whereas requirements to consider the welfare of citizens or to consider the inputs to citizens are much more abstract and are constructed in ways where sanctions would be almost impossible to pursue. Um, and we also see these issues related to rate setting, where, for example, even though there is a grievance redressal process theoretically, there is a requirement before entering into the grievance redressal process that one must settle all claimed dues. And so we are essentially creating a situation where even a legitimately disputed charge would have to be paid for a owner to even, or for a home occupier to even have the right to participate in grievance redressal, which one can argue is not consistent with procedural justice values. Um, so in conclusion, the kind of what we set out to do was look at what are the dimensions of procedural justice. We were able to define them as the four dimensions of voice, accountability, transparency, and correctability. We were able to set out a method by which documents can be assessed for the presence or absence of these specific institutional patterns. Um, and we are able to use large language models and demonstrate that large language models are effective at supporting this analysis and automating some of the most labor intensive components of this analysis. Um, so that's where I'll leave us. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kaninik, for that presentation. We'll open it now up to questions and comments from the audience. I already see Shuping's hand is up, so go ahead.
Thank you, Devor, and thank you for this amazing presentation. It's really awesome. So I have a question regarding like the second stage of your analysis after you use LLM is how you identify the institutional statements that you think have the like they're discussing accountability issues. Like I
Yeah.
hear you see like dictionary research, but can you say more? And I know it's like a large data set. How do you make
Yeah.
sure you're not missing out? And second, what like features are you looking for? Like, are you looking only on the context of the statement, or do you need like background information on if this statement is really addressing accountability issue, or you only look at like the aim? It's like a notify or information given aim, where you also look at like, attribute. Because I know that's harder, but I would like to know. Thank you.
Yeah, no, makes a ton of sense. So for this research, what we really ended up doing is after the institutional statements were coded, I literally just went through all 5,000 of them. And it made sense at that point, partly because there, as you said, it is really difficult to come up with an objective way of assessing this, and it was a little bit outside the scope of the analysis to try to generalize this infinitely. It's also just one case study. So the method that I found most effective was first to skim through all 5,000 of them, and just mark out ones that are, for lack of a better word, simple, where they're simply stating, things like the chair of the board must be this person, and the chair of the board must be so and so, and things like that. So after we eliminate things like that, we're left with about 1,000 or a couple of 1 or 2 thousand statements, and for the rest, like you said, we're literally just first looking at the aims, and just searching for words like notify, searching for words like inform, searching for words, in the case of say accountability, like sanction, punish, or look for explicit or else conditions in the institutional grammar. And you're right. There is no way of being 100% sure that we haven't missed something specific. And so the second step was really to look, which is why the qualitative component of it, where what we were doing was starting with a few statements that we think are interesting as a seed, and then looking at any statement that could be possibly connected to those, and that hopefully we have a complete picture of what's happening in the qualitative aspect of this. But I fully recognize that it is not yet perfect, and that there needs to be a lot more work done on methods of validating that things haven't been missed out.
I see. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a little bit query that can you elaborate your research questions one because I'm unable to find the novelty of the research apart from the IG's contribution. I got little confused, means how it's different from the other frameworks. We have
Yeah,
studies in this field, right? Chennai waters has been discussed so widely, and you know how
yeah. The case
how.
study is definitely not new. I would not go so far as to say the case study is new in the sense that Chennai's water supply issues are extremely broad and extremely well known. I'm trying to find my explicit research questions. Give me a minute. But the research questions are really much more about the method and are much more about the application of the method. So first of all, the underlying issue is that procedural justice specifically, which is relating to how decisions are taken, not what decisions are taken, is understudied. There are maybe only a dozen papers, especially in the context of climate change adaptation, that even refer to procedural justice in a climate change context. And as I said, most of the research that looks at procedural justice, as a field of research, is
Yes.
largely looking at it from the perspective of a after the fact kind of an analysis. The methodology used to assess procedural justice is dependent on being able to consult with citizens or stakeholders who have been participants in the process and who have already experienced the process, which is extremely limited when we are talking about if you are about to implement a project, you have not implemented it yet, those methods don't help you assess if it is effective.
Okay, so
Um,
you know about the 73rd and 74th Amendment, right? So
the
with this,
73rd and 74th constitutional amendment require, in theory, that powers be decentralized in the Indian context,
yes,
but
yes, yes.
in practice, what we see
Okay,
is that
that's
most
you know that this most of the documentation has been Tamil. Okay, if you go and see the records, the every word will mean separately. So how the IG will help in this? Because when you're talking about stakeholders, they don't talk in English. That I know. So
Right,
when they are talking,
but we're not talking about in the context of this research. We're also not really talking about interactions, and we're not talking about we're not researching the interactions. We're researching the policy documents, and which are the formal rules that have been written down, and the formal rules that are written are official documents in English published by the government
how
agencies responsible.
okay, so when there's a discussion over the formulation of us like paracetal, like whatever water board they have created, if they are coming up with some board, what are the decision they are making up? So you should know means how they are happening, what's the transaction or or in what context they want this to happen. Do this Chennai uh, municipality don't want to take any responsibility? Why? Because in India there is this parastatals has come up in last 20 years. Suddenly they are like half privatized, half government, no one wants to take responsibility. IS officers are becoming CEOs of these agencies and they are just uh, not doing their work properly. I can no I can say that way, but they are doing their own way. But when you are talking about when how these decisions are made, you the interaction is the main point, not the receiving end product. So how the decisions are made, if you want to contest that, i I will suspect that if you don't know the transaction, what they are having when they are going to talk about those things, how you will justify that?
I think we're talking about we're talking about different parts of the policy cycle. So
Yeah, so
I
how
think so.
how you will put it then?
I'm simply saying that my problem statement is not related to the part of the policy cycle that you're referring to, which is the actual policy creation process. If so, for example, if you're looking at the water supply board as an example, what I'm hearing from you is the process by which the board is formed, the process by which the governing act of the board is created. Whereas I am now in this research, what I'm really trying to look at is when you are past that point, the board already exists. There are already acts in place, and now the board as an actor is participating in a decision making arena related to forming a project, to administering a project, and to implementing a project. In that context, the act itself can be considered as a fixed artifact which is influencing behavior, and the objective is to attempt to comment on whether the act is sufficient or whether the act contains rules which would encourage decision makers to take more transparent, accountable, correctable
Have
decisions.
one more clarification to make. So, which literature you are going to do with? So, these are legal documents we are talking about. So, are you
Yes.
taking any legal approach to this?
Sorry.
Means theoretically, we can define some legal pluralism exists and other theories exist around this. So, how
Yes,
you
but
will put?
so the definitions of procedural justice that have been adopted for this research are coming from definitions which are from a very diverse range of definitions. From Rawlsian theory, they're coming from a bunch of different ideas of pure procedural justice, and so the idea is to kind of synthesize from those traditions quite a bit.
Okay, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Saba, go ahead.
Hi, Kaninik. Thank you very much for your presentation and sharing an update on the work that you've been doing at TU Delft. I guess I actually was interested in the very last thing you said in closing the presentation, which is that your next steps are to engage in some kind of validation exercises. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about, what that will entail.
Yeah. Without getting again into too much detail, because I mean, and I'm still working on it, we can maybe take it offline as well. But the idea is right now the LLM has only been really validated against one data set, and the way in which we have validated it is we have validated the going from atomic statements to IG2's tagged statements. The idea is now to actually go a little bit broader, to zoom out a bit, and to go from a page of a policy document to IG coded statements directly, rather than be relying, because what the tool that I've built is able to both automate the extraction of atomic statements from a policy document, and it is able to go from the atomic statement to the tagged statement. The idea is to then compare how a human researcher interacts with a page and to how the LLM interacts with a page. And so we want to set up some kind of an experiment that allows us to test against that, and be able to compare a couple of different types of documents, be able to compare a couple of different researchers, and see how that goes. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's the thing that we're super excited for right now.
I can imagine.
Any other questions from the audience?
I have several students on this call, Kaninik, who are interested in kind of using those automated approaches for coding. So I think they've been listening keenly to what you're talking about.
Yeah. I think someone physically has their hand up.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I could not locate the raise hand button. Anyway, my question is also about your use of large language models, and I would like to hear a little bit more. If you could go back to the slide where you put up the architecture.
Oh yeah, give me a second.
Yeah.
Get about this?
Yes. So, could you just, I know you did cover this in your talk, but could you just walk us through this a little more in detail, if that's possible?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's also we're going to publish this hopefully at some point in the near future. So, I mean, like, and feel free to drop down. I mean, sorry, message later. I can also make the code available. But so the main idea, the architecture may be a little bit confusing. If I just conceptually say what's happening, is that taking a PDF, passing the PDF to an LLM, not first pre-processing the PDF, doing all the standard stuff where we make sure removing all the headings, removing all the unnecessary text. If it has, I found a lot of issues with documents where there are hierarchically nested statements where you have like multi-level list indexes. So there is a deterministic step, which is taking those multi-level list indexes and turning them into a tree of statements, and then combining every sentence with its own parent in the tree so that we have complete statements. So there is that one whole deterministic thing that's happening. After that, each complete sentence now gets passed to a large language model, and it gets passed with instructions similar to what Dr. Siddiqui and Dr. Franz had in their codebook, which is discussing how to extract atomic statements from a complex statement. So what the first step of the LLM does is goes from these very complex sentences to multiple simple sentences. And so what you often find is one sentence turns into like 3 or 5 simpler sentences. And then each of those simpler sentences is then further being fed into a large language model again, which goes from that complex sentence into basically syntax attribute pairs for each of the different components of the syntax. we settled on this after a bunch of different iterations. So I mean, there have been a number of other attempts. I think Mike, I'm bad with names, but one of the earlier ones was instead of doing the last step as a generative step, was doing a lot of people would argue, why not just use labeling with a machine learning algorithm. But because this is such a low resource setting, there isn't enough data to train an adequate model. And so we found that we are doing a lot better with language models, especially generative language models in this context, than we would with a conventional kind of a machine learning or a tag thing. With the hope that maybe down the line we can use maybe a different architecture. We can maybe use a encoder architecture or something. But we're a few steps from that. Yeah. Does that I don't know, maybe TMI at the end, but I hope that makes sense.
No, I'd like to, if possible, talk to you a little bit more about this. If I can drop you an email and take it up.
No, that'd be awesome. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think
Shuping, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I will send you email after later too. But can you talk a little more about like why you choose those three API, or did you like try GPT as well? Because
yes.
that works really well on my data, like 90% accuracy, and you're like I see like 80%. Like are they more specific to IG coding?
I mean, no, it's not that they're more specific to IG coding. Also, I think I have used the GPT APIs as well. Like in the 4.0, I think I've used. I've not used the one before that. But I find even with when you say 90% accuracy, I think that's still like anecdotal how it feels, right? Rather than a systematic A/B test, right?
I did a random sample,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
randomly
exactly.
collect. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think the biggest thing here with the 80% kind of a thing is that it is a per token kind of accuracy metric. So for example, let's say that we look at the attribute, and the attribute is Chennai, Greater Chennai Corporation in the human coded benchmark, and in the what the LLM gives out is the Greater Chennai Corporation. Then this metric will actually say that the LLM is only 75% accurate because it had one extra word compared to what the human did, even though we as humans will be like, it means the same thing. So it's still a little bit of that happening. We need to take the metrics with a pinch of salt on that front. The other thing is the reason that that we use these large language models for the research is a couple of things. First of all, just cost. I have access to compute with TU Delft and at home, so it just made, even though it's like $10, it was just better to do it on my system while I was experimenting. I didn't want to just consume a bunch of credits. And repeatability is really good with GPT. From a scientific point of view, my concern was, okay, what if halfway through my testing they change the model version? I can no longer access a legacy version, things like that. I didn't want to expose myself to that risk. And the third thing is, I think there is a very strong argument for running these kinds of models locally, because if the idea is to give them sensitive policy documents, or to give them incomplete policy documents, or draft policy documents, and say, okay, comment on this so that we can do better before we make a final document, maybe potentially governments, enterprises that would be interested in this kind of a tool would want to have control. And so I just wanted to make sure we're building an architecture where we are using it with locally running models. And then if we can do it with a locally running model, we can always switch it out for an API. But if we're dependent on an API, we may not always make it abstract or modular enough to use it with something else.
I see. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So what are the best available options apart from Lalma?
Sorry?
Means what are the best available options for us, according to you?
If you want to just code a policy document, use GPT. It's easiest. it's ChatGPT is the easiest way to do it, especially if you don't have all of this set up. In terms of the local models, I'm trying to see if I can find the slide which has this data on it. What I found is that one Gemini works super well. Is this slide up? Performance is not correlated with general benchmarks. So what we also found is that the models on the left here, these are all models that are performing comparatively, performing relatively well on general language task performance. But we found that, so for example, Phi, which is Microsoft's model, even though it performs well on general benchmarks, doesn't necessarily perform well on this task. Similarly, with like Mixtral, which is a mixture of experts style model, performs well on general benchmarks, really underperforms on this kind of a task. Whereas Gemma, which a lot of people are like, it's okay for general language tasks, performs the best on this. And also, this is like an old version of Gemma. This is not also Gemma 2, which is out now, which is not in this research, but I've been using it and it performs way better than most other benchmarks out there. So I think this also kind of building up this evidence base that what's the word I'm looking for? Building up this evidence base that IG coding is actually a different kind of task than the other kind of language tasks that have been part of the general literature so far. But I mean, that's my feeling at this point, and have this much evidence to back that up.
The preference to this API is better than this right now, you will say.
I would say that it's easier if you're just trying to do a thing. It's easier to use the API.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, I think there's also one in the chat. The World Bank report is publicly available already. This one came out in 2021 already. It's on the World Bank website. And it's just there available for download. You just need to search for Chennai City Partnership and look at the download documents.
All right, Juan, go ahead.
Thank you, Devor, and thank you for the presentation. I think it was really interesting. If you don't mind, I will be sending you a message later, maybe to ask you some more questions. But basically, I have two things about the application of the process. First, can you go in an inductive way to look what kind of structures are there embedded in the policy text of the institutional statement, or do you have to have like as you did, like these hypothesized statement to find it? That's the first one. And the other thing is, how would it work with documents that are not in English? I'm sorry, I missed that part. Did you translate your documents, or did you use them in original language? And how do you think it for example, in Spanish?
Yeah. Second one is easier. Chennai, mostly the government has these documents in English already, so I didn't have to translate them. And I think that's good, and I think it's fine for the analysis we're doing now. Actually, we're trying with another colleague at TU Delft to maybe do this for Dutch as well. I think there are two things that we want to try. Either there are language models that are already multilingual. So I think Spanish is again a language where a ton of work has happened. So it would be probably as simple as translating the instructions to the model and using a model that speaks Spanish. But we'd have to do the benchmarks again, and we'd have to see how good it is. But in principle, it should be that straightforward to start out. Yeah, and I'd be super excited. I mean, to walk through that and to see how it performs with different languages. Yeah, and I think the alternative is always, you can always translate the documents, and the risks are exactly the same as giving a researcher a translated document. So I think that's also, I think, a perfectly valid. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's acceptable, I would say, to just do that. It's not going to do any worse than what a human being would do. The first question was sorry, would you remind me?
Yes, if you can go into the policy text looking for the structures of the institutional statement in an inductive way, or if you have to.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no. So what we did was inductive in the sense that first we coded everything, and then we were looking for sentences to start out with. The reason why we had to go looking for sentences was because the original idea was to turn all the sentences into one giant map. But in practice, what we encountered was a lot of issues with like data cleaning after the fact of like getting all the attributes aligned just right, so that the names are similar. And then how do you think about connections between aims devoid of context? And so that turned into a little bit of a rabbit hole that was just not solvable in the timeline. But it's not done yet. We need to figure it out, but it's doable in the sense that the rules that we used to form these networks were consistent. There is a set of four different kinds of connections that we're looking for, where where it's the same attribute, or where the attribute is the direct object, or where the attribute is mentioned in the activation condition of the previous statement. So these are things that again we could automate. It is just that it is, we're talking n squared now, and so we just decided that it's better to get an example out than to deep dive on that uh, at this point.
Thank you. Makes sense.
All right, so we are at the top of the hour, so we will wrap up things here. Thank you to Kaninik for coming here and presenting. Thank you to everyone for attending and for your questions and your comments. And we will see you all next month.
Awesome. Thanks so much.